The night the lanterns went out, no one heard the first scream. In the lowlands of Arkansas, where the earth stayed damp and the trees leaned close as if listening, the freed settlement slept with the uneasy peace of people who had learned not to dream too loudly. It was 1885, and freedom was supposed to have teeth by now. The cabin stood in a careful row, smoke, stained but proud, built by hands that had once been owned and now belonged, at least on paper, to themselves. Children memorized new last names. Men argued over crop prices. Women kept ledgers of births instead of losses. Yet the night air still carried the old fear, thick as river fog, the kind that settles in the chest without asking permission. Boots moved where no boots should have been. Horses waited without sound. A door opened, not broken, as if the house itself had been persuaded to betray its occupants. By morning, 3 beds were empty, their blankets folded too neatly to suggest flight. The sheriff's office would later call it vagrancy, then theft, then dead. Words were rearranged like furniture to make room for a lie. Those who asked questions were told to be grateful they were still breathing, told that freedom did not mean safety, only permission to survive quietly. By the second week, the settlement understood the pattern. Names were taken before bodies. Papers vanished. Freedom, it seemed, could be confiscated as easily as land, if the right men agreed to look the other way. Mothers began sleeping fully dressed. Fathers kept tools within reach, knowing tools were no match for badges and ropes. At dusk, the river reflected the sky like a black mirror, and in that reflection the community saw a future they recognized too well. One where chains had learned to hide behind the law, and bondage returned not with a whip, but with a signature and a smile. In the early months of 1885, the freed community in rural Arkansas lived in a fragile space between memory and hope, a place carved not by law, but by exhaustion and belief. They had settled near the lowlands because the soil was forgiving, and because no one else wanted it, which felt like a kind of mercy. The land still bore scars from years of forced labor, furrows cut too deep, trees stripped without care, but to the people who now worked it by choice, those scars felt like proof that something had been survived. Each cabin stood as quiet evidence of autonomy, built plank by hands that once labored under command and now moved according to their own will. The structures were modest, uneven, sometimes drafty, yet every nail driven into the wood carried a significance greater than comfort, because ownership itself had once been forbidden. Prosperity arrived not as wealth but as stability, and even that felt dangerous to acknowledge. Corn grew in straight, disciplined rows. Sweet potatoes filled baskets instead of quotas, and small livestock wandered freely instead of being counted by overseers. Men gathered in the evenings to talk about selling surplus crops in nearby towns, speaking carefully, aware that ambition had once been punished. Women kept journals and family records, marking birthdays and marriages, acts that felt radical after generations where family lines were deliberately broken. Children attended makeshift lessons, learning letters and numbers under the shade of trees, their laughter startling in its freedom, their futures still undefined enough to feel real. Despite this cautious growth, the past lingered like an old wound that refused to close. Every adult carried memories that did not fade simply because the law had changed. The sound of hooves still caused heads to turn. A raised voice still tightened shoulders. Freedom had arrived through ink and signatures, not through forgiveness or safety, and everyone understood that paper could burn. They trusted one another deeply, bound by shared suffering, but trust in the outside world remained thin and brittle. News traveled slowly and selectively, often distorted by fear, and rumors of violence elsewhere drifted in like smoke from distant fires, impossible to trace yet impossible to ignore. The community learned to celebrate quietly. Gatherings were small, hymns were sung softly, and joy was measured, parceled out in ways that would not attract attention. It was not cowardice, but survival, a lesson passed down without needing explanation. Too much success had once invited cruelty. Too much visibility had once led to chains. So they prospered in ways that were easy to overlook, improving their lives inch by inch, believing that patience itself might be a shield. When they spoke of the future, they did so in careful language, framing hope as responsibility rather than desire, as if wanting too much could summon consequences. Still, there was a subtle shift in the air, one that even the most cautious could not deny. For the first time, the days followed a rhythm chosen by the people themselves. Work began when the sun rose, not when a horn sounded. Rest was taken when bodies failed, not when permission was granted. This autonomy, small as it seemed, rewired something deep within them. They began to stand differently, to meet one another's eyes more steadily, to correct each other gently, instead of flinching at imagined authority. The settlement felt like a place being slowly reclaimed from a long occupation, not by force but by presence. Yet beneath this fragile normalcy lay an unspoken understanding that freedom had not erased the appetite for control that surrounded them. Nearby towns still viewed the settlement with suspicion or resentment, their prosperity interpreted as defiance. Old hierarchies had lost legal backing, but not emotional investment, and resentment does not require permission to act. The community sensed this hostility in small ways, in the way merchants overcharged them, in the way strangers lingered too long at the edge of the land, counting faces, memorizing routines. These moments were dismissed aloud, laughed off as paranoia, but privately they settled into the gut like cold stones. Even so, the people chose to believe, because belief itself had become an act of resistance. To imagine a future where their children would never know bondage required a faith stronger than fear. They told themselves that time would blunt old hatreds, that laws would eventually protect what they had earned, that the world could move forward if given enough distance from its crimes. This belief did not erase caution, but it allowed them to sleep, to wake, to plant and harvest without constantly bracing for catastrophe. In this brief season, the community existed in a narrow window, where freedom felt almost solid, where the past loosened its grip just enough for hope to take root, and where the idea of being taken back seemed unthinkable. Not because it was impossible, but because it was too cruel to accept without first exhausting every reason to believe otherwise at the first disappearance. Did not announce itself as a crisis. It arrived quietly, disguised as a misunderstanding, the kind of absence that could still be explained away if one wanted to believe the world was improving. A young man named Elijah failed to return from a neighboring town where he had gone to trade corn for tools. By nightfall, his wife told herself he had found work and stayed late, or that the roads had grown muddy and slowed his return. The community had learned to delay panic, because panic had once been used against them. But unease spread anyway, moving through conversations in half-finished sentences and long pauses. When morning came and Elijah's mule was found tied near the road, calm explanations lost their shape. The animal stood patient and confused, its packs empty, its reins neatly knotted as if by someone with time and intention. That detail unsettled everyone more than blood or signs of struggle would have, because it suggested order, not chaos. Someone had planned this. Someone had taken Elijah and wanted the act to look reasonable, even polite. The absence began to feel deliberate, like a subtraction performed carefully so the total would not be noticed right away. Within days, another name joined the silence. Then another. Always people who traveled alone, who crossed invisible borders between the settlement and the towns beyond it. Always men and women who carried proof of work, receipts, or letters meant to protect them. Those items never came back. The pattern revealed itself slowly, like an image emerging in dark water, and when it did, the community felt a collective chill. Freedom was not being challenged openly. It was being erased quietly, one person at a time, without spectacle or warning. Families searched in ways they thought were safe. They asked questions that sounded casual. They visited offices where officials pretended to be helpful, their smiles practiced and thin. Each inquiry ended in confusion, in records that could not be found, in accusations that the missing had moved on without telling anyone. The suggestion itself carried a cruelty that cut deep, because it implied abandonment, a voluntary severing of family bonds that history had already forced upon them too many times. The disappearances began to feel like a second captivity, not only of bodies, but of truth itself. At night, the settlement changed. Doors were barred earlier. Children were kept close, their games shortened, their laughter muted. People began to count heads at gatherings, a habit that felt disturbingly familiar. The freedom they had trusted as a foundation revealed itself as something conditional, something that could be withdrawn without notice. Fear did not explode, it settled, heavy and patient, teaching everyone to measure their movements, to think twice before traveling, to question whether visibility itself was a risk. Rumors filled the silence left by facts. Some whispered of secret jails, others of work camps hidden under different names. There were stories of men taken south, of women forced into labor under contracts they never signed. No one could confirm anything, and that uncertainty was its own weapon. Without proof, grief could not resolve into anger, and without anger, resistance could not organize. The community existed in a suspended state, mourning without funerals, hoping without evidence, trapped between disbelief and dread. What made the fear sharper was the realization that the law offered no refuge. Official channels produced only paper barriers and polite refusals. Old debts were suddenly mentioned, debts no one remembered incurring. Accusations appeared without witnesses, charges without trials. The language of legality was being twisted into a net, fine enough to pass unnoticed, but strong enough to hold anyone caught within it. Freedom, it became clear, could be revoked retroactively, as if it had only ever been a temporary condition. As the weeks passed, the disappearances reshaped relationships within the settlement. Trust narrowed. People questioned who might be watched, who might be next. Guilt crept in, quiet and corrosive, as those who remained wondered if their safety came at the cost of someone else's capture. Every goodbye felt heavier. Every departure carried the possibility of finality. Mothers memorized the details of their children's faces, as if preparing for loss they could not name aloud. Yet beneath the fear, a something else began to form. A shared understanding that these vanishings were not accidents or coincidences, but a system at work, one that depended on silence and isolation to survive. The community sensed that freedom was being dismantled carefully, stripped away in increments small enough to avoid attention, but large enough to remind them of their vulnerability. The truth hovered just beyond reach, close enough to wound, far enough to deny. And in that space, terror learned to wear the mask of normal life, blending into routine, until the extraordinary cruelty of it all began to feel almost ordinary. The truth about the lawmen surfaced, not through bravery but through fatigue, the kind that dulls fear and sharpens attention. The sheriff had always been present, in the background of the settlement's dealings, a familiar figure whose authority felt unavoidable rather than protective. He spoke slowly, listened with a practiced tilt of the head, and kept records with meticulous care, as if order itself lived in his ledgers. When the first disappearances were reported, he responded with sympathy measured carefully enough to sound sincere. He assured families that men wandered, that work was scarce, that freedom allowed movement even when it caused pain. His words were calm, reasonable, and deeply misleading. Suspicion began with a detail too small to dismiss. A woman seeking her brother noticed his name, misspelled in the sheriff's book, altered just enough to fracture his identity. Another man found a debt listed beside his missing cousin's name. A debt no one remembered owing, attached to a date that predated emancipation itself. These inconsistencies did not announce guilt, but they whispered it. The lawman's records were not merely inaccurate. They were being reshaped, curated to support a story that justified absence as consequence rather than crime. As more families compared notes in private, patterns emerged that could not be ignored. Every missing person had passed through the sheriff's jurisdiction. Shortly before vanishing, every official explanation traced back to paperwork he controlled. Old plantation accounts, once dismissed as relics, resurfaced with fresh ink and official seals. The sheriff claimed he was only enforcing obligations that had never been settled, implying that freedom had come with conditions that no one had fully understood. His authority transformed history into evidence, turning inherited suffering into legal leverage. The realization that the law itself was complicit struck the community with a particular kind of terror. Violence could be resisted, but legality carried the weight of inevitability. The sheriff did not need to threaten or chase. He summoned, he filed, he declared. Men were taken not in the night, but in daylight, escorted politely, told they would return once matters were resolved. They did not return. Their absence was explained away as procedure, as correction, as the unfortunate cost of order. Those who confronted him directly were met with patience sharpened into menace. He reminded them of loitering laws, of vagrancy statutes, of the dangers of disorder. He spoke of protecting the county from unrest, positioning himself as a bulwark against chaos while quietly manufacturing it. His badge did not glint with violence, but with inevitability, a symbol that absorbed resistance and returned it as futility. Every appeal to justice was redirected through his authority, ensuring that the answer would always serve the same end. What made his betrayal more devastating was how seamlessly it blended into daily life. He attended church. He shook hands. He listened to grievances with a grave expression that suggested concern rather than calculation. The community realized too late that his role was not to enforce the law as written, but to interpret it in ways that restored control under a different name. Slavery had not vanished. It had been archived, reindexed, and quietly reissued. Fear shifted shape after this understanding took hold. It was no longer for strangers or shadows, but for systems that wore familiar faces. People avoided the sheriff's gaze, measured their words, destroyed documents that might be twisted into weapons. They learned that innocence offered no protection when guilt could be manufactured retroactively. The lawman's power lay not in brute force, but in his ability to redefine truth, to turn survival itself into evidence of wrongdoing. Some considered fleeing, but flight carried its own risks. Without papers, movement invited suspicion. With papers, movement invited scrutiny. The sheriff controlled the margins of legitimacy, deciding who belonged within them and who could be pushed beyond. His office became a threshold through which freedom passed, and often failed to return. Every stamp, every signature carried the weight of potential disappearance. As the weeks wore on, the community stopped asking whether the sheriff was involved, and began asking how deeply the rot extended. If one man could manipulate the law so completely, how many others benefited from the same arrangement? merchants, clerks, labor contractors, all connected by documents and silence. The revelation did not arrive as a single moment of clarity, but as a slow accumulation of dread. The understanding that the system designed to protect them had instead been repurposed to reclaim them, and that the badge meant to symbolize order had become the quiet instrument through which bondage was being restored without chains. The survivors did not uncover the truth all at once, because the truth had been deliberately broken into pieces, scattered across offices, contracts, and whispered arrangements that never existed in one place long enough to be named. It began with a rumor carried back by a man who had narrowly avoided arrest, someone who had overheard a conversation not meant for him. He spoke of work camps described as correctional facilities, of men and women held not as property, but as laborers, repaying obligations, and of documents that transformed kidnapping into compliance. The language alone was enough to chill those who listened, because it sounded familiar in the way a nightmare does, echoing older words that had once justified ownership. As fragments accumulated, the picture grew sharper and more horrifying. Those taken had not vanished into chaos or lawlessness. They had been processed. Their names were entered into new ledgers, separate from the ones kept by the sheriff, ledgers maintained by private contractors and county officials who operated just far enough from public view to avoid scrutiny. The captives were labeled as offenders, debtors, or vagrants, crimes so vague they required no proof. Once labeled, they were leased out to farms, mills, and rail crews, their labor sold under the claim that discipline and work were acts of reform. The survivors learned that these arrangements were not hidden accidents, but structured systems. Contracts existed between the county and local businesses, signed with legal precision. The language emphasized rehabilitation, order, and economic necessity, carefully avoiding any mention of coercion. On paper, the captives were being corrected. In reality, they were being worked to exhaustion, housed in conditions that mirrored the worst memories of bondage, punished for slowing down, denied contact with family, denied even the dignity of being acknowledged as victims. What made this revelation unbearable was how seamlessly it fit into the world beyond the settlement. Towns benefited from cheaper labor, crops were harvested faster, rail lines expanded. The prosperity built on stolen bodies blended into everyday life, allowing those who profited to claim ignorance. If questioned, they pointed to documents, to seals, to official approvals, insisting everything was lawful. The system depended on this diffusion of responsibility, on the idea that no single person could be blamed, because everyone was simply following procedure. For the families left behind, the knowledge introduced a new kind of grief. Their loved ones were not lost to the unknown. They were alive, suffering, and unreachable by design. Letters never arrived because correspondence was forbidden. Visits were impossible because locations were undisclosed. The captives existed in a suspended state, neither enslaved nor free, trapped in a legal fiction that stripped them of rights while preserving the appearance of justice. This ambiguity was not a flaw, but a feature, making intervention difficult and outrage easy to dismiss. The survivors understood then that resistance would not look like escape alone. Even if someone fled a camp, the law would pursue them, branding their flight as further evidence of criminality. The system anticipated rebellion and absorbed it, converting defiance into justification for harsher treatment. Freedom had been reframed as something that could be revoked temporarily, indefinitely, or permanently, depending on the needs of those in power. Fear spread outward from this realization, reshaping how people thought about movement, speech, and survival. Every interaction with authority became a calculation. Every minor conflict carried the risk of escalation into accusation. The idea that one could be forced back into bondage not by chains, but by clauses revealed how fragile emancipation truly was. It had not been dismantled openly because open dismantling would provoke resistance. Instead, it had been hollowed out, leaving a structure that looked intact until one stepped inside. The survivors also recognized the cruelty of time within this system. There was no clear sentence, no defined end to the labor imposed. Debts could be extended, infractions invented, corrections prolonged indefinitely. People disappeared into work details and aged there, their youth consumed by labor justified as punishment. Children grew without parents not because of death, but because separation had been legalized. The suffering was ongoing, renewable, designed to sustain itself as long as profit demanded. This understanding stripped away the last illusions about safety. The threat was not limited to those already taken. It hovered over everyone, a constant reminder that freedom existed only as long as it remained unchallenging. The community saw that bondage had not returned wearing the old face of ownership, but a new one shaped like bureaucracy and reform. Its cruelty softened by language, its violence hidden behind ink and approval. And that this transformation made it more dangerous than before, because it asked the world to believe that what was being done was not cruelty at all. But Kara the Ledger did not appear dramatically, nor was it discovered through heroism or confrontation, but through neglect. As many dangerous truths are, it was found in a locked cabinet that had not been opened in years, tucked behind newer files that spoke the polished language of reform and progress. A clerk who had grown careless, or perhaps tired of lies, left the cabinet unsecured while searching for a different document. Inside lay pages yellowed with age, their edges worn thin by handling, their ink faded but still legible. The ledger was heavy, not only in weight but in implication, its presence suggesting a history that had never ended, only learned to crouch in the shadows. At first glance, it looked like an artifact, a remnant of an older world that no longer applied. Names were listed in columns, dates recorded with precision, amounts owed carefully tallied. But as survivors studied it more closely, they recognized the pattern. The names matched those who had disappeared. The debts aligned with accusations recently invented. Entries continued well past the year slavery had supposedly ended. The handwriting changing over time, but the structure remaining intact. This was not a forgotten relic. It was an active document, maintained quietly, updated to reflect a system that pretended to be new while relying on the old. What horrified them most was the continuity. There was no clean break between bondage and freedom in those pages. No moment where ownership ceased and autonomy began. Instead, there was a shift in language, a relabeling of control. Where one column had once indicated purchase price, another now listed fines. Where labor duration had once been indefinite by decree, it was now indefinite by calculation. The ledger revealed that the system had never been dismantled because dismantling would have required accountability. It had simply been renamed, its machinery preserved beneath a layer of legality, thin enough to pass inspection. The document traced connections that survivors had only suspected before. Sheriffs, judges, contractors, merchants, all referenced indirectly through initials and codes, their involvement shielded but undeniable. The ledger was not just a record of exploitation, but a map of collaboration, showing how authority and profit intersected to sustain control. It explained why resistance had failed elsewhere, why complaints vanished, why investigations stalled. The answers were not scattered. They were centralized, written plainly for those who knew how to read them. For the community, the ledger was both vindication and sentence. It proved they were not imagining the pattern, that the disappearances were not random or deserved. But proof did not equal power. Possessing the ledger did not mean they could expose it without consequence. To reveal it openly would invite retaliation, accusations of theft, forgery, or sedition. The truth itself was dangerous because it threatened not just individuals, but an entire structure that relied on silence to survive. Still, the ledger changed something fundamental. Fear shifted into clarity. The survivors understood now that they were not fighting isolated acts of cruelty, but a system that had adapted intelligently, learning how to survive moral scrutiny by wearing the costume of reform. The danger was not only in what the system did, but in how convincingly it justified itself. It spoke of order, rehabilitation, and economic necessity, words that soothed those who did not wish to look closer. The knowledge carried a heavy cost. Once seen, the ledger could not be unseen. Every interaction with authority was reframed by its existence. Every official reassurance rang hollow. The survivors realized that appeals to justice within the system were futile because the system's purpose was not justice, but continuity. It existed to ensure that power never fully loosened its grip, even when laws demanded it. The ledger also revealed how deeply time had been weaponized. Debts could be inherited, extended, recalculated. A man could labor for years and still owe more than when he began. Children could grow into obligations they never chose. The future itself was collateral, pledged to maintain a balance that was never meant to be settled. This understanding stripped away any remaining belief that patience alone could lead to safety. Yet within this bleak revelation, something hardened rather than broke. The community recognized that survival would require memory, documentation, and quiet defiance. If the system relied on secrecy, then remembering became an act of resistance. If bondage had been preserved through ledgers and ink, then truth would have to be preserved the same way. The ledger taught them that freedom had never been granted fully, only postponed, and that reclaiming it would demand more than endurance. As the pages were returned to their hiding place, their existence spread through whispers and careful glances, binding the community together in a shared understanding that what threatened them was not chaos but design, not lawlessness but precision, and that the past they were told was over had in fact been waiting patiently, reorganized and renamed, ready to reassert itself the moment vigilance faltered. The ending did not arrive as justice, because justice requires witnesses willing to stand in daylight, and daylight was a luxury the community could not afford. It arrived instead as a choice made quietly, collectively, and without ceremony. The ledger was copied by hand, page by page, its truths divided and hidden in places where fire, flood, or a single betrayal could not erase them all. Names were memorized. Rotes were altered. Children were taught not only letters but histories that had been deliberately obscured, lessons spoken softly, but repeated until they could not be forgotten. The settlement loosened its visible roots, while strengthening the invisible ones, preparing for movement without announcing it, learning to vanish in ways that did not resemble flight. Some left under cover of night, not in panic, but with intention, traveling along paths mapped through trust rather than roads. Others stayed, choosing to remain as witnesses embedded within the system, watching, recording, surviving where they were least expected to. The sheriff continued his work. The contracts continued to circulate, and the machinery of quiet bondage continued to turn, but it no longer moved unseen. Every disappearance was noted. Every lie was compared against memory. The system thrived on isolation, and isolation was slowly being denied to it. Years later, stories would surface in fragments, in courtrooms far away, in newspapers that treated them as anomalies rather than design. The ledger would never be displayed whole, never honored as evidence in the way it deserved. But its contents would seep into the world nonetheless, carried by those who had learned that survival was not the same as silence. The community itself would scatter, its physical shape dissolving, but its knowledge enduring, passed from mouth to mouth, page to page, generation to generation. What remained was not victory, but continuity of a different kind. The kind that refuses erasure. The kind that understands that freedom is not a moment secured by law, but a condition that must be guarded relentlessly against those who profit from its absence. In Arkansas, the land would forget their footprints. The cabins would collapse back into the soil, and official records would insist that order had been maintained. But beneath that official memory, another one persisted, unfiled and unapproved, carrying the truth that bondage had tried to return quietly, and that, just as quietly, it had been named, remembered, and denied the comfort of being forgotten.